this whole kind of process of kind of disarming paramilitaries, freedom fighters, terrorists, militia groups, whatever phraseology you want to use. There's been a lot of studies carried out really on the negotiations between Loyalists and Republicans, between governments and paramilitaries, but there haven't been as many studies done about the internal processes within the Republican movement or within Loyalism. So myself and two colleagues who are working in the Middle East, and we actually tried to adapt some of this to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as well, but we'll not go there. We will be here to midnight, so we'll keep it focused on the process within Loyalism at the moment, and just try to kind of tease that out a little. So first thing I want to kind of highlight is this kind of hidden history of making peace, and we're calling that a sort of inter-group consensus building. Okay, let me read a statement to you, which was the statement that was put together by the Ulster Volunteer Force. So the statement goes, following a direct engagement with all the units and departments of our organisation, the leadership of the Ulster Volunteer Force and Red Hand Commando today made public the outcome of the 3-year consultation process. As of 12 midnight, Thursday, 3rd of May 2007, the Ulster Volunteer Force and Red Hand Commando will assume a non-military civilianised role. All recruitment has ceased, military training has ceased, targeting has ceased, and all intelligence rendered obsolete. All active service units have been deactivated. We encourage our volunteers to embrace the challenges which continue to face their communities and support their continued participation in non-military capacities. So really in 2007 it was called, within the sort of Ulster Volunteer Force, Red Hand, it was called a statement of intent. Okay? At that stage there was no decommissioning had taken place, and we'll look at that at a moment. So really they were announcing their transition from military to civilian or political organisations, and all have since handed over the vast majority of their weapons. And I think a number of folk knew that they did their decommissioning statement in my building in Belfast, the kind of Skenos Project East Belfast mission. It was almost surreal in a sense, because most of these statements that these guys had done in the past were done with hoods on, dark clothing, invariably behind tables. But to see someone come up in a suit, no mask, church podium, and a bouquet of flowers beside them kind of changed that whole image almost to the sort of hard men of loyalism. And I think for a number of us there in that room, you know, knowing the process that it took to get to that, I must say, while I didn't have any tears shed, but there was a lump in the throat, knowing the process that had happened to allow these people to move towards that. I mean, I was saying earlier, a large part of the literature really around these kind of sort of negotiation and sort of conflict resolution literature does focus on the dialogue, the debate, the discussion between what we would call warring factions. So there hasn't been a lot of research done around this kind of internal negotiation, both within republicanism and also within loyalism. I think kind of specifically, we probably know substantially less about the sort of consensus building that's occurred within many violent groups even across the globe, and you know, hopefully some of this dialogue that's taking place, and I mean that this is being published eventually in the States and also in the Middle East, will allow some more studies to be done in relation to some of those what we would call internal conversations. Let me suggest to you that the kind of lack of solid backing from a leader's constituency in general will ultimately jeopardise and even kill a peace process. Before and even during and even after inter-party negotiations. So really, I think for anyone to try to move militia groups to a table for negotiation without coordination, without any allied support from all their factions, it's going to die pretty quick in the water. So really what we would call sort of active spoilers can sink ongoing negotiations pretty easily, and any person involved in negotiation needs to be aware of that. I think as well, when militant members are alienated from their leadership as well, creates difficulty, and even the formation of the LVF spilling out of the UVF, while today they're pretty redundant. I mean, there were a number of feuds that myself and one or two others had to negotiate between the LVF and the UVF because there just wasn't enough internal negotiation and leadership in relation to that. I think thirdly, when a kind of given organisation also sits at a negotiating table against the wishes of its own constituency and its own combatants, it's quite difficult. I mean, they're moving away from kind of militia groups at the moment. I mean, I would be privately sort of facilitating some dialogue between DUP and Sinn Féin, and I've often said, so I'm not kind of saying this sort of privately because I've said it publicly. I mean, I know that both Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness, and I know them both reasonably well, and as I look at Peter Robinson, his job's incredibly difficult, and I sort of psychologically analyse him like this. I think Peter probably lives in three worlds. I think the first world he lives in is the world of a statesperson. And I think many times both him and McGuinness together have done a good job, despite some of the criticism they get on the ground. The second world Peter would live in would be the world, obviously, of wanting to get that East Belfast seat back for the DUP. It hurt them pretty tough, as you all know, when Naomi took that seat, so that's the kind of second world he's living in. The third world he's living in is really dealing with the right-wing fundamentalists within the DUP, of which there's still a third. So that's even moving that into a kind of political framework, and none of those right-wing fundamentalists, while they may carry large Bibles, they're not carrying guns. Okay, so trying to move that sort of messy process into disarming a militia group. So there's got to be a lot of caution trying to bring the bulk of your constituency with you. So sort of looking then at that sort of Northern Ireland conflict, the post-agreement consensus building for non-violent and disarmament was just as crucial. I mean, I think a lot of folks sort of look at the kind of lead up there to the sort of Good Friday Agreement. I mean, post-Good Friday Agreement, there's been a multiplicity of strands really to keep a number of these militia groups from moving back to balance. I mean, I remember after the two British soldiers were shot dead at the Mazarine barracks, the sort of district commander in sort of south of East Belfast, calling myself, bringing together the constituency of the UVF, Red Hand and UDA, wanting to know was there going to be a reaction from them. And thankfully there wasn't. Basically they were asking for assurances that the PSNI were going to do their job and pursue those dissidents who had been involved in the murder of those two soldiers as rigorously as possible. But even small incidents, and they are small, and I'm not minimising the death of two people, but even the death of two people could have destroyed for a period of time a very hard-earned peace process. So even post-Good Friday, there's still a hell of a lot of work ongoing on the ground. Okay, let me just kind of move to the next point. Really, the ceasefire, the peace treaty, to disarming, to reintegration. So Good Friday, 10th of April 1998, after 800, 400, whatever amount of years you want to put in that of violence, 80 years of partition, 30 years that we call the Troubles, over 3,500 people dead, 35,000 injured, 16,000 charged with terrorist-related offences, 34,000 shootings, 14,000 bombings, and a population of 1.7 million people. So since the 1960s, most of us know the story, that kind of bloody conflict between Republicans and between Loyalists. And getting to yes wasn't an easy task. I mean, the process that led to that Good Friday Agreement was long, it was complex, there were years of back-channel talks, two main ceasefires, and eventually we moved towards the Good Friday Agreement. Implementing the Good Friday Agreement, I would suggest, has been an accomplishment of almost monumental proportions, especially looking at the challenge of spoilers. The LVF, the Loyalist Volunteer Force, the Real IRA, Continuity IRA, the main militant groups, the IRA, INLA, UDA, UVF, Red Hand, maintained their commitment, and they really prevented, in large-scale, mass-scale defections. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, to me personally, we'll talk about this in a minute, I think it was a masterpiece in political compromise. I think Francis Deeney's quotation that he put in the Queen's blog there about a year ago that I've often quoted, where he said, "We most certainly knew how to end the war, we just don't know how to build a peace. You know, and I think, I mean, it's an umbrella term, it's a very sexy type of term, but it's quite an accurate term. Because, I mean, statistically, as all of us know in this room, you know, 90% of people are still living in segregated areas, 93% are still educated separately. So, in reality, sometimes, as I look at our peace process, use that phraseology, sometimes John Hume's prophetic term that we've ended up with a sort of benign apartheid was pretty prophetic. And, I mean, I was on a consultation yesterday, it's called Together Building a United Community. I think and next week I'm doing a paper in Queens, and there's 5 areas. I think they're looking at the past and emotions. So here we are, even all these years, 16 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, still painfully moving to try to cement peace. I mean, some of the comments yesterday at this kind of conference was interesting, and at times some people do look at Stormont and actually say, you know, they were asking for how to define sectarianism, which one person said, you know, there's been definitions in relation to sectarianism for a long time. So there is a sizable gap, a number of commentators will be saying at the moment, between what is happening in Stormont and what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, I was on a working party in sectarianism from 1990 to 1992. I mean, it was Mary McAleese was one of the chairs and John Lampin was the other chair. So I mean, as far back as 90 and 92, there were groups trying to kind of historically look at some of the roots of sectarianism, both religiously and politically. And here we have OFM, DFM in 2014 looking for definitions. So there's a kind of major gap between sort of politics and what's happening on the ground. Let me look for a moment at what I'm sort of calling the kind of challenge of selling peace to combatants. Any person that studied militia groups will tell you the kind of psyche of freedom fighters or terrorists or militia groups is always resentment and distrust towards their enemy. So that kind of psychological leap from conflict to engagement is an especially difficult one to make. I mean, more substantially, combatants, especially if they're on a full-time basis, as a number of them were, they have a number of kind of direct incentives to continue fighting. Economic benefits, a sense of identity, belonging and social prestige from their status. So I want to kind of highlight a number of sort of points just under this challenge of selling peace. Internal agents of change, the role of ex-prisoners. Former Loyalist prisoners continue to play a key role, especially those who were released from sort of 1989 right through to the early 1990s. And many of these people brought very deep questions in relation to the role of loyalism. I remember a very senior UVF figure telling me a story when he arrived in Long Kesh in 1974. Gusty Spence asked him the question, "Why are you here?" To which he responded, "I'm here for the cause." And Gusty pushed him further and said, "What do you mean by the cause?" So even as far back as 74, 75, conversations were happening. I will wipe my brow. This warm climate of Dublin compared with Belfast. So even as far back as 74 and 75, there were a lot of hard debates and dialogues taking place within Long Kesh within loyalism. Someone put it like this: I served 15 years to preserve the British state. And it was the British state that put me in prison. What does that say about our battle, about our political ideology? So really their status as questions gave them enough credibility and enough legitimacy as loyal patriots to ask questions and to be heard. In the kind of years there just leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, there were a number of serious discussions around loyalism. I mean, they were asking the question about using violence. Was this really helping to transform loyalist communities? So while becoming agents of change by stressing the dire local impact of violence, those discussions gradually eroded the sort of old school ethos of other combatants in the community. Let me just move on there. So let me talk about tools for building support for the ceasefires, the sort of track one peace negotiations. I'm just simply calling that explanation, reframing and consultation. So really through the whole of the 1990s, Loyalist leaders were able to convince their members to observe a ceasefire, then to favour peace negotiations with the IRA by what I'm calling explaining and reframing the enemy. Okay, so it's a very kind of key phrase. And that was due to the fact that many senior loyalists, particularly ex-prisoners, had been about Republicans and were beginning to understand the Republican ethos. I mean, I remember the Shankill bombing quite graphically. At that stage I was serving it was based in West Belfast, but a sort of part-time chaplaincy in the Royal Victoria Hospital. And I mean, I could still close my eyes and see myself outside the Vader Hospital on the Crumlin Road, holding Alan McBride, saying to me about his wife Gary, she's gone, she's gone. Being in the Royal Victoria Hospital that night, when I can tell you the exact time, at 20 to 9, being at the bedside of Wilma McKee, who, if you know the story, got the all clear for cancer on the Friday, was caught up in the bombing on the Saturday, and I could still close my eyes and see that hospital corridor with her mum, her dad, her husband, her 14-year-old and her 12-year-old son. So lots of loyalists then were asking the question 3 or 4 days later in relation to Adams, who was beginning to mouth the words of peace, why he was carrying the coffin of an IRA bomber. And it created quite a backlash within loyalists. But those who were more perceptive began to say, there's a reason why he's doing that. And it's literally about bringing your movement with them. I mean, some of the work I would do around the Middle East at the moment, and speaking to certain groups, and a number of us have been saying to them, the key thing in peace negotiations, if you're moving away from violence, is you need to bring the majority of people with you. And I mean, there's the moment if you look at militia groups in the Middle East, I guess most of them have spent a long, long time doing list after list after list. You know, from Hamas to Islamic Jihad, and you now got Islamic State. You've a multiplicity of groups that are attached to Al Qaeda, and you've all this fragmentation of Islamic terrorist groups. And I think eventually, as some of these groups do move off the stage, it's going to be increasingly problematic because of this ability within a number of these groups to move into a considerable number of different factions. So it was important that loyalists were reframing, were explaining what republicanism was actually about, and that was simply about keeping the movement together and moving as many people into the peace process as possible. So following sort of Good Friday Agreement 1998, the ability of those leaders to explain and reframe the words and the actions of the other side was essential. So phrases like keeping their own people on board. Don't pay too much attention to what they're saying. They don't mean it literally. I mean, the whole furore in the last 12 months over the Castle Dare parade, I know a number of senior Republicans, probably deep down inside, didn't want that parade to happen, but it was a case, because there was some difficulty in that area, of flexing the Republican muscles to say to the dissidents, we're still the toughest guys. It's the same over the whole Ardoin thing as well, and I've been involved in a number of conversations around that, and I said to a senior IR figure about that parade eventually going up and then moving towards the 3 parades, there's still tensions. And so for many of these people, explaining and reframing is a key component. The Ulster Volunteer Force are also held a very, what I would call a kind of systematic internal consultation process. And that's happened on a multiplicity of occasions to allow these people to move off the stage. Let me just spill on to the next sort of point. I just want to kind of call that tools for building support for a permanent on-arms strategy. So it's expanding somewhat just from the reframing and the consultation to the political empowerment and also community development. A number of leaders within Loyalism were pretty determined not just to ensure support for a ceasefire, but also on reframing non-violence as a kind of continuation of their struggle. So as opposed to then republicanism, the way we would have defined that was moving towards the issue of parading. So that became part of the unarmed struggle, the plethora of residence group opposing parades. That was their way of keeping a number of the troops on board, removing the Armalite from the armed struggle, but also non-violent protest. So even a kind of, a decade after the peace agreement, that 2007 endgame statement that I read, they haven't announced their past. For example, the UDA said this: the battle flags of the Ulster freedom fighters will be furled in a hope that they may never have to see the light of day again, but they stand in readiness. For the UVF in the Red Hand, the phrase they used was, the mainstream Republican offensive has ended, the Union remains safe. So that was their logic, their umbrella term, their mantra for moving towards non-violence. Okay, let me just take a few moments and talk about this case study, Action for Community Transformation. At the moment I sit on that kind of group, I'm one of the sort of non-combatants on it, and it's that whole process of DDR, which was demilitarization, decommissioning and reintegration. So we're really at the kind of R stage, really, within the UVF and the Red Hand at the moment, which actually is the most difficult and the most protracted and the most painful process, trying to reintegrate these people back into their communities. I mean, for example, 1 in 5 ex-prisoners are drinking themselves to death. Anybody within the field of mental health can produce statistic after statistic of just the ongoing chaos in many of these people's lives. I mean, at our organisation, I'm sort of directing a new sort of post at the moment, but prior to that, as many of you know, I headed up East Belfast Mission and that Skynos project, and we took on 13 facility staff, and we made a conscious decision. Yes, we discriminated. We said we would take on people who had served lengthy prison sentences, because we felt as an organisation dedicated to peace building and to social justice that that was an important statement to make. But one of those people we took on has often said to me, Gary, I go to sleep at night with the faces of the dead on my ceiling. So that kind of reintegration process is incredibly complex. And that's why I've often argued in relation to the Good Friday Agreement, while it was a masterpiece in political compromise, it was not a masterpiece in building peace. Because I think it was incredibly weak as regards dealing with victims, dealing with flags, dealing with parades. And I think the whole pain of the past is something that sooner rather than later we're going to have to grapple with. Before I came down here this morning, I'm a kind of sort of fitness fanatic. I went to the gym and there were 2 or 3 former RUC people in the changing room with me, and they were saying, George Hamilton, who you should know was the new chief constable, was saying, it's not my job to deal with the past, just the present. So that conversation is ongoing. Will there be an amnesty? Will there not be an amnesty? Will there be further supergrass trials? What are we going to do about the whole UVF and Hegarty thing? So in reality, in an article I wrote about 6 months ago for a kind of a paper in GBRE, I said, as I drive the 1.2 miles to my office every day, the past screams out to me from every gable wall. So literally from my house in Ballyhacklemore in East Belfast, as I drive the Lower Newton Ards Road, I pass a plethora of wall murals that tell me about the past. And so that's shaping people's mentality constantly. So let me tell you a little bit about that. The first stage of that was a transitional phase that was really setting up kind of training processes or learning processes in relation to former combatants. Things like mediation, child protection, suicide prevention, community safety, media training, employment preparation and placement. Now by 2012, almost 1,700 ex-combatants had gone through that training. And that, knowing these organisations, that was no mean achievement. The second phase of that was an operational stage, which was really aiming to engage UVF and Red Hand volunteers as well as their local communities by connecting them to organisations such as mine, and networks for community development. The next stage really is the political stage, which was moving volunteers into civic engagement. Last October, November, we decided, sort of myself and one or two others, once a month we would meet with the leadership of the UVF and the Red Hand. And it was interesting, it was on the day where the determination came out, I think it was the 5th of July, my memory serves me right, that the return leg creative ordering wouldn't happen. And I remember saying to Joyce, my wife, when I was going up to that meeting on a Saturday, you know what, this whole day will be spent arguing and debating about parades. Actually, it wasn't. The whole day was spent debating education on the Shankle. And if you're following the news, you'll probably have seen the initiative there, the Jackie Redpath, who's the CEO of the Greater Shankle Partnership, was just launched. So slowly it's trying to move people away from that parading debate and saying there's a wider context of reintegration which involves the whole process of education and wider issues. Paramilitaries now refer to themselves much more as community workers and community activists, and I'll tell you a humorous story in relation to that. In March 2008, we had a visit prior to beginning that kind of Skenos project from the palace. So we had the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, and the whole thing was obviously choreographed to bring some of these people in from the cold, and I was sort of escorting the Queen around the building, introducing her to different people, and a colleague of mine was escorting the Duke of Edinburgh, who, as you know, at times has some verbal diarrhoea. He kind of says it as it is there, so to speak, and having met his 10th community worker, he turned to my colleague and he said, everybody in this room seems to be a bloody community worker. And a little did he kind of realise at that stage, he was meeting all these kind of senior loyalist figures, and this was the NIO's way of sort of bringing them in from the cold and meeting the palace. So there's been a kind of new phraseology used in relation to how they describe themselves. Moving up there to decommissioning, the UVF had 3 years of what they call roadshows. So again, it's going back to that whole concept of bringing every person with you. I mean, I know a number of people who I know of the conversations with Hamas, and a conversation with Hamas said to them once, don't worry about the Israelis, to which they obviously all had a rather sharp intake of breath. And they said, no, you need to worry about your own movement. Because when the time comes, if you enter into negotiations with the Israelis, you need to bring your movement with you. And that's why the UVF did what they did. They had 3 solid years of roadshows, so there was no sense, to use their sort of military terminology, the brigade staff, which primarily sit in the Shankle, making a decision, right, all weapons are being decommissioned. So they had units in Liverpool and in Manchester and in Glasgow, so there's a kind of GB Northern Ireland consultation to make sure that on the 29th of June 2009, when the statement was made, that the vast majority of people were stepping over the line. So that whole internal consultation process is crucial in relation to any militia group. I'm just going to check time. What time did I talk about? 4-ish or so? Was that? Yeah, where we are? Yeah, is that? Yeah, just keep me right. Okay, let me just push on a little here. Just want to look at that sort of the whole kind of faith leaders as kind of critical friends. There's probably about 4 or 5 people that the sort of UVF Red Hand would describe as sort of critical friends, and I would sort of be one of them, really, and walk with them, you know, over a number of years. In fact, in May 2012, I took the leadership of the UVF and the Red Hand to Israel and Palestine, really to tell their story in the international stage. I mean, most of us know in the room that, you know, republicanism primarily have been much more wined and dined on the international stage than what loyalism would be. And I think really for loyalists, in a sense, to feel that their story has been authenticated, their journey towards peace has been authenticated, I think their critical friends have a key role in saying that. And I still remember vividly walking through, behind a number of folk, walking through Arabish Jerusalem, on the way to a drinks reception at the British Consul. And I remember turning to a group of Palestinians and Israelis and Americans and saying, just seeing that is progress. Just seeing that sight is progress. Knowing that their journey, painful, chaotic, messy, difficult as it was, and it was difficult, that critical friends have a role to play in these people's lives. Now, myself and others do come under scrutiny for talking to the men of violence. And the quotation that I put in this article, this paper that we put together, may say, I'm well aware of the risks. The one can be seen to be endorsing violence, I guess, at the extreme, or at the least giving these people credibility. But I've used this phrase over the years, my role is one of engagement, not endorsement. Okay? And I do firmly believe that a person of faith in any religious tradition should be taking risks for peace. So let me give you another example of that. On Sunday, Monday and Tuesday of, not this week, but the following week, I will be hosting a group of ultra-Orthodox Jewish people in Belfast. Okay? Members of Shas. Okay? Now, this is some of the hidden stories in the Middle East that never reaches this volatile island who either takes the side of Palestine or Israel. The main rabbi of Shas, their chief rabbi, Rabbi Yosef, who died in October last year. Here's his quotation. The sanctity of life is more important than the sanctity of land. Okay. That's one of the chief rabbis of Israel. Okay. The sanctity of life is more important than the sanctity of land. So many ultra-Orthodox now are dialoguing quietly with Palestinians. And one of my roles as a faith leader, working within an international framework, is to say that the person of faith can take more strategic risks than politicians can. As I say, my boss is God, and hopefully I'm not going to say it for a few years, so I'm kind of, sort of at the moment, get out of jail free card in a sense. So I just think it's crucial that key faith leaders should be taking those risks. And I know a number of folk, particularly within that sort of ultra-Orthodox, which has been a very close world, are slowly stepping out and beginning dialogue with folk who they have perceived as their enemy. There are a number of ultra-Orthodox women who for the first time did a master's in conflict transformation, and they now have locked in strongly to meeting people within Ramallah and within Nablus. So there are a number of processes that are behind the scenes that I think key faith leaders within any community can take risks. I mean, South Africa is another typical example. Okay, just let me kind of pull this quickly to a close, and then we'll maybe just take some questions and have a conversation together. Okay, so a couple of elements, engagement, okay? Integrate rather than alienate potential spoilers. So the process of dialogue between communities and within communities requires a strategy of engagement with and knowledge of both potential spoilers and their narratives. Okay, reframing. So your enemy may reframe your actions to look victorious. I mean, look at the statements coming out of Gaza and coming out of Israel at the moment. Both won. Was it a draw? Did anyone lose? Who knows? But you need to understand that your enemy may reframe your actions to look as, but that will actually allow them flexibility to move towards peace. Also use reframing as a face-saving tool to convince your own constituency that you're not abandoning your cause. So in turn, it may allow both sides to frame what is a compromise, which is what the Good Friday Agreement was, as a victory, while also strifting strategy without having to denounce the past. Promote grassroots ownership, so invest in direct communication and consultation with basis of support, actively seek to prepare people for peace, and in doing so, it is important to rely on internal agents of change and also involve external critical friends. So for example, in the lead up to decommissioning, certain people were able to use me, I guess, as a kind of scapegoat, and the guarantee was if the meeting became public and went wrong, I took the blame. Because governments were not meant to be talking to terrorists or paramilitaries. So people were able, because of the presence of myself and others, to sit in a room along with people, to have conversations, and if the meeting went wrong, I gave them permission to say publicly that I had invited them, me, to a meeting of community activists. So people need to be willing, I think again underlining that, particularly in that faith community, to take strategic risks as critical friends for peace. Also develop the community around combatants. So offer alternative roles and ways to demonstrate loyalty. Create viable and sustainable reintegration programs that address former combatants' financial needs, political identity, psychological well-being. Decommission people's minds, not just their weapons. And build a long-term strategy. So I'm suggesting there that consensus building must be seen as continuous and a dynamic process, even 15, 16 years post-agreement. And so the question should not just be how to get the yes, but also how to keep that initial consensus for a peace agreement after the peace is signed. Let me just give you a final quotation here that my friend John Brewer, who many of you know at Queen's. John's written a lot on what he calls the social peace process, and we have a look at some of the stuff. It's very, very good, and it really talks about people like ourselves in this room who are part of that social peace process. And he writes this: however, the negotiated settlement is never the end of peacemaking. For accords mostly leave unresolved the processes. He has this wonderful phrase for realising social healing. And that is what I refer to as the social peace process. And then he says this: the problem is that societal healing is either ignored by the negotiators in the peace process, or assumed to follow naturally from the signing of the agreement itself. He suggests as a rather naive assumption that once you sort out problematic politics, societal healing occurs almost effortlessly. He says we need to recognise there's a social peace process, a need for healing within society. Peace process then become the responsibility who live in societies emerging out of the conflict and the domain in which they function. And I think that still is probably one of the weaknesses of our peace processes. I mean, for the middle classes, things in Belfast and wider reasonably good. But for many of those within the inner city, life is pretty chaotic. I mean, a friend of mine who was working in East Belfast Mission, he lives in the Belmont Road, which is leafy suburbs. It's not that far from the Lower Newton Arch Road, if you know it. But he brought his son down to a meeting in East Belfast Mission, and this kid, like at 22, got out of his car, stood in Newton Arch Road, and he turns to his dad and he says, "Daddy, this is the first time I've been to Newton Arch Road." The kid was like 1.2 miles away. So I think a critique as well, I would do that. I think the middle classes do need to have that role of societal healing. So I'll stop there before I end up in the puddle of sweat because it's so warm. Okay, any thoughts or questions? Yeah, go ahead, sir.